In 1976, Edward Nevin III, a young trial lawyer, was riding a commuter train into San Francisco when he opened the morning paper and found his dead grandfather's name in a story about the United States military. The old man had died 26 years earlier. The article explained, for the first time, what the Navy had released over the city the autumn he fell ill. For a generation, the official record held that Edward Nevin, a 75-year-old retired pipe fitter, died of an ordinary hospital infection in the winter of 1950. That version was not a lie so much as a silence, because in the same weeks Nevin lay dying at Stanford Hospital, a Navy vessel had been spraying a living bacterial cloud across San Francisco Bay, and no one outside a classified program knew. The documents that would connect those two facts stayed sealed for 26 years. When they surfaced, through a leak and then a congressional record, they raised a question the government has never been willing to answer in open court. Did the cloud kill him? Hold on to that question. The evidence does not resolve it cleanly, and that, it turns out, is the point. Begin with the operation itself, because it is documented down to the day. Between September 20th and September 27th, 1950, a United States Navy minesweeper held position roughly 2 miles off the Golden Gate Bridge. From hoses mounted on its deck, the crew released a fine aerosol into the prevailing wind. The cloud drifted inland through the fog, across the rooftops of a city of roughly 800,000 people. None of them had been told. None of them had consented. None of them would learn the truth for a quarter of a century. The cloud carried 2 organisms. One was Bacillus globigii, then believed harmless. The other was Serratia Marcescens, a bacterium chosen for a single useful property. It produces a vivid red pigment. Spray it over a city, collect air samples on Petri dishes days later, and the red colonies make it simple to map exactly how far a biological agent would travel if an enemy ever tried this for real. That was the entire purpose. San Francisco was not a target of war. It was a test surface, a stand-in for the Soviet attack the Pentagon feared, and a measure of how defenseless an American city actually was. The measurements were thorough. 43 monitoring stations ringed the Bay Area, each sampling the air as the bacteria moved through it. The red colonies turned up as far as 23 miles from the ship. By the Army's own later estimate, nearly every one of the city's residents inhaled thousands of the particles, thousands each. That figure comes from the military's own analysis, not from a critic of it, and it raises the obvious question, the one the city would not get to ask for 26 years. If a cloud dense enough to dose 800,000 lungs drifts over a hospital full of vulnerable patients, what happens inside that hospital? The answer arrived on October 11th. On October 11th, 1950, 11 patients were admitted to Stanford Hospital with a strange and serious infection. The bacterium responsible was Serratia Marcescens, the same organism, by name the Navy had sprayed 3 weeks earlier. The coincidence is hard to set aside because Serratia infection was, at the time, almost unheard of. In the entire documented medical history of San Francisco, not one prior case had been recorded. Now 11 arrived at once. 10 of the 11 recovered. 1 did not. Edward Nevin had entered the hospital for care following prostate surgery. The infection reached his heart, settling into a valve, a condition called endocarditis, and 3 weeks after admission, he was dead. He was 75. The cluster was so anomalous that the Stanford physicians did something telling. They wrote it up for a medical journal, publishing the outbreak in the American Medical Association's Archive of Internal Medicine. They could not explain where a near non-existent bacterium had suddenly come from. They noted the mystery, watched for new cases, and when none appeared, set it aside as a fluke. They had no way to know what had drifted over the city that September. The operational file that would have told them was classified. Stop, consider what that means. A team of physicians published the precise evidence of a possible harm in a peer-reviewed journal. Names, dates, the organism itself, and it changed nothing because the one document that connected it to a cause sat sealed in a military archive. The evidence was public, the explanation was classified, and the gap between them was wide enough for a man to die in. But here is the complication, and there is no honest way around it. That the spray caused these infections has never been proven. The Army would later offer a competing explanation, one that, on the documented facts, is not easy to dismiss. To weigh it, the pattern behind this single city has to come into view, because San Francisco was not the experiment. It was one line in a list of 239. Here is the part that turns a single strange autumn into something else entirely. San Francisco was not an isolated decision. It was one operation inside a program that ran, by the military's own later disclosure, for 20 years. Between 1949 and 1969, the United States conducted 239 open-air biological tests over its own territory. In 80 of them, the agent released was live bacteria, organisms the Army's researchers believed at the time to be harmless. The list reads like a map of ordinary American life. In the 1950s, Serratia was dispersed over Panama City and Key West in Florida with no recorded illnesses. Zinc cadmium sulfide, a compound now understood to be carcinogenic, was released over Minnesota and other states to study how particles travel. It was detected more than 1,000 miles away in New York. In 1966, researchers dropped light bulbs filled with bacteria onto the tracks of the New York City subway, and the cloud rode the trains for miles beneath Manhattan. In 1965, an agent was released at Washington's National Airport and a bus terminal. More than 100 travelers were exposed and carried it onward to cities across several states. None of these people knew they were inside an experiment. This was the work of a dedicated unit, the Special Operations Division, based at the Army's Biological Research Center at Camp Detrick in Maryland. Its assignment was not to defend against a known attack. It was to find out what an attack would do, how a city breathes, how a crowd carries a contagion, how far a cloud will drift before it thins. To answer those questions with real data, the division needed a real population that did not know it was being studied. That is the pattern. Not one rogue test off the California coast, but a sustained, documented, institutionally approved practice of using unwitting Americans as instruments of measurement. And it reframes everything about Edward Nevin, because once the pattern is visible, the Army's defense of the San Francisco test becomes something stranger than a denial. The officers who ran these operations did not, on the record, claim the spray was harmless because they were certain. They claimed something more revealing. To understand it, the file has to open on the year the secret finally broke. For 26 years, the file stayed shut. Then, in December 1976, a reporter at the newspaper Newsday obtained classified documents describing the program and published them. The San Francisco Chronicle followed with the local story about the Navy ship, the bacteria, the autumn of 1950. And on a commuter train one morning, Edward Nevin III read his grandfather's name in that account and understood for the first time how the old man might have died. In February 1977, with the story spreading and a lawsuit forming, the Army released a long internal history of its biological warfare testing, covering 1942 to 1977. For the first time, the open-air tests were on the record. Then, from March to May, the Senate Subcommittee on Health and Scientific Research held hearings, and the officers who had run the program were called to testify. This is where the story refuses to simplify. Under oath, the Army acknowledged the San Francisco test but rejected the link to Nevin's death. And the argument was not hand-waving. All 11 Stanford patients, the Army noted, had recently undergone medical procedures. The outbreak was confined to a single hospital. No other hospital in the Dose City, and the cloud covered the entire city, reported a matching cluster. If a bacterial fog dense enough to reach 800,000 people had truly caused those infections, the cases should not have stopped at one building's walls. That is a serious argument. It deserves to be stated plainly, not buried. On the documented evidence, the more likely source of the Stanford infections may well have been inside Stanford, a contaminated instrument, a procedure, the ordinary hazards of mid-century surgery. The timing with Operation Sea Spray may be exactly what the Army called it, a coincidence. And yet, the man who commanded the biological warfare effort, General William Creasy, was among those who testified. But the defense of the program would ultimately rest not on that medical argument at all. It would rest on a principle. And it is that principle, not the question of one death, that a courtroom would soon be asked to rule on, because the Nevin family had decided to sue. In 1981, Edward Nevin's surviving family filed suit against the Army, the Navy, the Defense Department, and the United States government, seeking $11 million. The case came before a federal judge, Samuel Conti. The family lost, and how they lost matters more than that they lost. The court gave two reasons. The first was the one the Army had argued. The family could not prove that the sprayed bacteria, rather than a hospital source, had killed Edward Nevin. On the evidence, that finding was defensible. But the court did not stop there. It reached for a second, larger ground. And this is the part that outlives the case. The government, the court held, was immune, not because the test was harmless, not because it was justified, but because the decision to conduct it fell within the discretion of the military, and courts may not sit in judgment of that discretion. When the family appealed, the Ninth Circuit affirmed, ruling that judicial review of such operations would impair the effective administration of programs believed vital to the defense of the United States. Read that again. Not that the spraying was lawful in some narrow sense, that a court was not permitted to ask whether it should have happened at all. The Supreme Court was asked to take the case. It declined. And with that, the legal record closed on a quiet, extraordinary conclusion. The question of whether the cloud killed Edward Nevin was never resolved. The question of whether the government was allowed to make that cloud, that one was answered in the affirmative. Edward Nevin died in the winter of 1950, and the most honest verdict on his death is that no one will ever know for certain. The proof was never collected, because collecting it was never the plan. A population that is not told it is being studied cannot be followed. Subjects who do not know they are subjects leave no record connecting cause to effect. The same secrecy that made the test possible made its consequences permanently unprovable. That is not an accident of the story. It is the architecture of it. The documents are public now. The bibliography sits in the description below. The congressional record, the Army's released history, the court rulings, the journal that recorded 11 infections no one could explain. Anyone can read them, almost no one does. And the principle the courtroom affirmed has never been overturned. The program ended in 1969. The doctrine that shielded it did not. It still stands in the same volumes, waiting for the next decision a court will be told it cannot review. The fog lifted over San Francisco a long time ago. What it carried, the record still holds.